In the summer of 1695, somewhere in the warm, dark waters of the Arabian Sea, the largest and most valuable ship in the world was making its way home. Her name was Ganji Sawai. In Persian, the name means exceeding treasure, and for once, a name was not an exaggeration. She was enormous, a vessel of 80 guns, crewed by hundreds of soldiers and sailors, carrying over 600 passengers on her decks. She had just completed the Hajj, the great Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca, and she was now returning to the port of Surat on the western coast of India. On board were Muslim pilgrims, court officials, and some of the wealthiest merchants in the Mughal Empire, the most powerful empire in Asia and one of the richest states on earth. And in her hold, locked away in iron-banded chests, was the fortune that made her a target unlike any other in the history of the sea. Historians have argued for centuries about the exact value of what she carried. Gold, silver, jewels, ivory, the personal wealth of nobles returning from the Holy Land. The most conservative estimates put the total at somewhere around 50,000 pounds in the currency of the time. In today's money, depending on how you calculate it, somewhere between $50 and $200 million. All of it on one ship, moving slowly through the Arabian Sea, and somewhere behind her, closing fast, was a man the world would come to know as Long Ben. His real name was Henry Every, and he was about to commit the single most audacious act of piracy in recorded history. Henry Every is one of history's great ghosts. Unlike Blackbeard, who built his legend deliberately and publicly, Every left almost nothing behind. No portraits, no letters, no detailed records of his early life. What we know of him comes largely from court documents, the accounts of his victims, and the sensationalized reports of journalists who wrote about him after the fact, by which point the line between fact and legend had already blurred beyond recovery. What we do know is this: he was English, born somewhere around 1659, almost certainly in the West Country, Devon or Plymouth, the same seafaring corner of England that produced so many of history's great sailors and pirates. He went to sea young, as most men of his background did, and spent years working on merchant vessels and naval ships before finding his way, as so many did in the 1690s, into the gray world between legal privateering and outright piracy. By 1694, he was serving as first mate on a privateer vessel called the Charles II, operating out of Spain. The ship's captain was incompetent, the men were unpaid, and the mission had stalled entirely. Every did what capable men throughout history have done when faced with incompetent leadership. He took over. In a calm, bloodless mutiny in the spring of 1694, Every convinced the crew to seize the ship, rename her the Fancy, and elect him captain. He then issued a statement, a kind of open letter to the English naval world, that was remarkable for its clarity and its confidence. He announced that he intended to seek his fortune on the open sea. He invited any passing English vessel to join him if they wished, and he promised in language that was almost courtly that he had no intention of harming English or Dutch shipping. He was, in other words, drawing a very precise line around his ambitions. He was not going to war with everyone. He was going to war with the Mughal Empire. It was a strategic decision as much as a moral one. The Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb was at that time the wealthiest monarch on earth, ruling over a subcontinent of extraordinary richness. His ships, the great pilgrim vessels that sailed annually between Surat and the Red Sea, were floating treasuries, carrying the accumulated wealth of the richest empire in Asia, back and forth across the Indian Ocean. For a man of Avery's intelligence and ambition, the logic was straightforward. Why rob a dozen small ships when you could rob one ship that was worth all of them combined? The plan required patience. Avery spent more than a year hunting in the waters around the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, the narrow corridor through which the great Mughal pilgrim fleet had to pass on its way to and from Mecca. He was not alone. He had fallen in with a small consortium of pirate vessels, 5 other ships whose captains had agreed to hunt together and split whatever they found. The combined fleet was not impressive on paper. 6 ships of varying size and condition, crewed by perhaps 500 men in total. Against the Mughal pilgrim fleet, which traveled with armed escorts and whose flagship, the Ganji Sawai, carried 80 guns and hundreds of soldiers, it was, on the face of it, a mismatch. The summer of 1695 brought a stroke of luck, or rather, a stroke of the kind of fortune that tends to find men who are patient and prepared. The Mughal fleet, returning from Mecca, was caught in a fierce storm in the Red Sea. Several ships were damaged, the fleet was scattered, and when the Ganji Sawai and her companion vessel, the smaller Fateh Muhammad, emerged from the storm and made for open water, they were no longer sailing in the safety of a convoy. They were alone. Avery's lookout spotted them first. The Fateh Muhammad was taken quickly. She offered little resistance, and her cargo, while significant, was only a prelude. Avery redistributed his fleet, sent the smaller ships to manage the captured vessel, and turned the fancy toward the larger prize. The Ganji Sawai saw him coming. What happened next was one of the most consequential naval engagements of the 17th century, not because of its scale, but because of what it set in motion. The Ganji Sawai's captain was a man named Muhammad Ibrahim. He commanded a ship of 80 guns, a vessel that should, by any reasonable calculation, have been able to defend itself against a single pirate sloop. The defense began badly and got worse. In the opening exchange of fire, one of the Ganji Sawai's own cannons exploded on her deck, a catastrophic malfunction that killed several of her gunners, scattered her gun crews, and sent a wave of panic through her soldiers and passengers. In the smoke and confusion that followed, Avery brought the fancy alongside, and his men went over the railing. The fighting on deck was brutal and brief. The Mughal soldiers, already shaken by the cannon explosion and overwhelmed by the ferocity of the pirates, broke. Some fought, many ran. Within a remarkably short time, accounts suggest no more than 2 or 3 hours from first contact to final surrender, the greatest prize in the history of piracy was in Henry Avery's hands. What followed the surrender is a dark chapter in the story. Avery's men spent 3 days aboard the Ganji Sawai before releasing her. The treatment of the passengers and crew during those 3 days was brutal, a violence that Avery himself may or may not have ordered or controlled, but which he was held responsible for nonetheless. The accounts that reached the Mughal court were horrifying, and they ignited a diplomatic crisis that would reshape the entire relationship between the English East India Company and the most powerful empire in Asia. Emperor Aurangzeb was furious in a way that went beyond ordinary outrage. The Ganji Sawai was not just any ship, it was his ship. The passengers included members of his court. The pilgrims aboard had been traveling under his protection, under the banner of his empire, in the name of his faith. The attack was not merely piracy. It was, in the emperor's eyes, a personal insult of the gravest kind, an assault on the dignity of the Mughal throne itself. He responded accordingly. He arrested the officials of the English East India Company, in Surat. He threatened to expel the English from India entirely. He demanded that the perpetrators be found, tried, and punished, and he made clear that if England could not control its pirates, England could not expect to maintain its trading privileges in his empire. The English government, suddenly faced with the potential loss of its most lucrative trade relationship in the world, reacted with a speed and intensity it had rarely shown before. Henry Every became the most wanted man on earth. The reward offered for his capture was enormous. Warrants were issued across every English colony and trading post in the world. His name, his description, and the name of his ship were circulated from the Caribbean to the Cape of Good Hope. And then Henry Every did something that no one expected. He simply disappeared. The Fancy was last reliably sighted off the island of Nassau in the Bahamas in the spring of 1696. Every distributed the plunder among his crew, each man receiving a share worth several times what he could have expected to earn in a lifetime of honest sailing. And then the crew scattered to the winds, slipping back into the ordinary world with new names and heavy pockets. Every himself was never found. There were sightings. There are always sightings of famous fugitives. He was reported in Ireland. He was reported in the Caribbean. One account, written decades later, claimed he had returned to England in disguise, being cheated out of his fortune by Bristol merchants who knew who he was and used that knowledge against him, and died in poverty in Devon, having spent the last years of his life unable to reclaim his own stolen wealth without revealing his identity. It is a story almost too poetic to be true. The greatest thief in history, robbed and turned by men with ledgers and lawyers instead of cutlasses. Whether it is true or not, no one knows. What is certain is this: Henry Every was never captured, never tried, never hanged. In an era when the English government was executing pirates by the dozens, when the noose at Execution Dock in London was rarely empty, the man who had committed the most spectacular act of piracy in history walked away. He became, in the years after his disappearance, something close to a myth. Plays were written about him, novels. His story was told and retold in the taverns of every port city in the Atlantic world, each retelling added new details, new riches, new escapes. In some versions, he became a king, ruling a pirate paradise on the island of Madagascar. In others, he was a tragic figure, haunted by what he had done, unable to enjoy the fortune he had taken. None of these stories can be verified. All of them say something true, because Henry Every understood something that most pirates, most criminals, most people who live outside the law never quite grasp. The heist is only half the job. The other half is the exit. He planned both, and he executed both perfectly. The plunder of the Ganges Sawai sent shockwaves through the world that lasted for decades. It nearly destroyed the English East India Company. It changed the way European powers thought about piracy, not as a minor nuisance, but as a genuine threat to international trade and diplomacy. It helped trigger the great crackdown on piracy that would, within 2 decades, bring the Golden Age to its end. And the man who caused all of it was never seen again. Somewhere, in the autumn of 1696, Henry Every walked off a ship and into a crowd, and the sea closed over his wake as if he had never existed. The exceeding treasure was gone, and so was he. Thank you for joining me tonight on Dead Calm History. Henry Every pulled off the greatest robbery in the history of the sea, and then vanished so completely that we still don't know where he went, or how he ended, or whether he ever looked back. Some men leave monuments, some men leave legends. Henry Schreier left nothing but an empty horizon on a question that 300 years have not been able to answer. The sea keeps its secrets well. Until next time, I wish you a calm and peaceful night.